On the evening of October 17th, 1956, at approximately 9:43 p.m., three men sat in the back room of Rao's restaurant on East 114th Street in East Harlem. The room smelled of cigar smoke and red sauce. A single lamp illuminated the mahogany table where ledgers lay open, columns of numbers filling page after page. Vincent "Vinny Books" Costello was 42 years old, the Genovese family's most trusted accountant. He'd been counting money for the mob since 1941, 15 years of tracking numbers, laundering profits, and ensuring every dollar was accounted for. The man to his left was Anthony "Tony Numbers" Rizzo, 37, who specialized in policy operations. The man to his right was Frank Salerno, 51, a capo who oversaw gambling operations in East Harlem and had recently expanded into territory that bordered Bumpy Johnson's operations in Central Harlem. They were counting the week's take from policy games, the numbers racket that generated millions of dollars annually across New York City. The Italian families controlled most of it, had controlled it since the mid-1930s when they'd muscled into operations that black entrepreneurs like Stephanie St. Clair had pioneered. But there was one section of Harlem they'd never fully controlled, the 23 blocks that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had run since 1935. An understanding had existed for 2 decades, an informal treaty that kept the peace. The Italians ran their operations. Bumpy ran his. Money flowed. Nobody got greedy. Until October 1956, when someone miscalculated. The Harlem numbers, Vinny said, tapping a column in the ledger. Week of October 8th through 14th. We show $127,000 in gross receipts. After payouts, protection, and operating costs, net profit should be $43,700. Tony leaned closer. That's up 18% from last month. The expansion's working. Frank Salerno nodded. We've been pushing into new territory. 125th to 135th Street. New runners. New locations. Bumpy's been losing ground. Has he complained? Vinny asked. No. That's what's interesting. Usually he makes noise when we encroach. But this time, nothing. Radio silence. Vinny wrote down the final number. $43,700. He closed the ledger, locked it in a safe behind the bar, and the three men left Rao's at 10:17 p.m., satisfied that the week's accounting was complete. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known sitting in that back room with their ledgers and their cigars, was that while they were counting their money, Bumpy Johnson was recounting his. Or more accurately, he was ensuring that when morning came, the numbers they'd just recorded would be completely, impossibly wrong. By 6 a.m. on October 18th, Vinny Costello would discover that $43,700 had somehow become $11,200. By noon, Frank Salerno would learn that 6 of his most reliable policy runners had vanished overnight. By evening, the Genovese family would understand that someone had just pulled off one of the most sophisticated financial maneuvers in organized crime history. No money was stolen. No violence occurred. No laws, at least no mob laws, were technically broken. But somehow, between the time Vinny closed that ledger at 10:17 p.m. on October 17th and the time he opened it again at 6 a.m. on October 18th, an entire week's worth of policy profits had evaporated like steam off morning coffee. The question wasn't just how Bumpy Johnson had done it. The question was how long he'd been planning it. Because operations this precise, maneuvers this surgical, don't happen overnight. They happen after months of preparation, after countless hours of intelligence gathering, after carefully positioning every piece exactly where it needs to be, so that when you finally move, your opponent doesn't realize they've lost until the game is already over. And by the morning of October 18th, 1956, the game was definitely over. The Italian mob just didn't know it yet. To understand what happened in October 1956, you need to understand the numbers racket, the most profitable gambling operation in Harlem's history and the source of constant tension between black entrepreneurs in Italian organized crime. The numbers game was simple. Players bet on a three-digit number, typically derived from published financial data like stock exchange figures or racetrack totals. Bets started as low as a penny. If your number hit, you won 600 to 1. The odds of winning were actually 1,000 to 1, which meant the house kept a 40% margin on every dollar wagered. By 1956, the numbers racket generated an estimated $100 million annually in New York City alone. Of that, approximately $15 to $20 million flowed through Harlem. It employed thousands of people, runners who collected bets, controllers who managed runners, bankers who financed operations, and accountants who tracked every transaction. The numbers game had been invented in Harlem. In the 1920s, black entrepreneurs like Casper Hallstein and Stephanie St. Clair built empires on it. But in the mid-1930s, the Italian Mafia, specifically the Luciano family, later reorganized into the Genovese family, decided they wanted in. They muscled their way into operations through a combination of violence, political connections, and financial pressure. By 1936, most major policy operations in Harlem were under Italian control. Most, but not all. Bumpy Johnson, who'd been working for Stephanie St. Clair since 1930, understood something the Italians didn't. You can't completely control an economy you don't completely understand. The numbers game in Harlem wasn't just gambling. It was a community institution. People played numbers the way they attended church, regularly, faithfully, with deeply personal significance. So when the Italians took over in 1936, Bumpy negotiated. He convinced them that maintaining some black-controlled operations would be good for business. It would keep the community engaged. It would prevent resentment. It would ensure smooth operations without constant resistance. The Italians agreed, partially because Bumpy's argument made sense, partially because Bumpy had already demonstrated he was too dangerous to completely eliminate. A treaty was established. The Italians controlled most of Harlem's policy operations. Bumpy controlled a section, 23 blocks in central Harlem, roughly between 127th and 145th Streets, from 5th Avenue to 8th Avenue. For 20 years, the arrangement worked. The Italians made their money. Bumpy made his. Occasional tensions arose, but they were managed through negotiation rather than war. But by 1956, things were changing. Frank Salerno, the Genovese capo who oversaw gambling operations, had ambitions. He saw Bumpy's territory not as a negotiated treaty zone, but as untapped potential. He began pushing policy runners into Bumpy's blocks. Not aggressively, not violently, just gradually expanding, testing boundaries, seeing how far he could go before resistance materialized. Between June and October 1956, Salerno had placed approximately 30 new policy runners in territory that had traditionally been Bumpy's. He'd established 3 new collection points. He'd begun recruiting customers who'd previously played with Bumpy's operations. The same customers, betting the same numbers, with both operations. How? Simple. A customer would bet $5 on number 437 with Marcus, who was working for Salerno. Marcus would record it in the Italian books. But he'd also tell the customer, if 437 hits, come to this address. And he'd provide a different location, one controlled by Bumpy's network. You'll get paid there. Faster. Better. The customers understood. Harlem residents had been playing numbers for decades. They knew how the system worked. They knew that insurance, betting the same number with multiple operations, was smart strategy. So when number 437 hit, the customer collected from Bumpy's operation. They didn't collect from Salerno's operation because, technically, they'd never placed the bet there. Marcus had recorded it in his books, but he'd recorded it as a bet that lost. The customer had already been paid, just not by the people Salerno thought were paying them. For 4 months, this system had been operating in plain sight. The Italians' ledgers showed profits. Their runners seemed productive. Their expansion seemed successful. But underneath the recorded numbers was a shadow economy. Bets that existed in Italian records, but were actually being paid out by Bumpy's operation. Why would customers participate? Because Bumpy paid faster, more reliably, with better customer service. And because Harlem residents generally preferred supporting black-owned operations when possible. Why would runners risk it? Because they were being paid by both operations. Commission from the Italians for recording bets, commission from Bumpy for actually servicing customers. And why would Bumpy spend money paying out winnings on bets the Italians thought they'd won? Because he was building proof, documentation, evidence that the Italian expansion was a mirage, that their numbers were fiction, that their supposed $43,700 weekly profit was actually closer to $11,200 once you subtracted the bets that were being paid elsewhere. In that church basement on October 17th, the six runners compiled their complete records. Every bet, every payout, every customer. 4 months of parallel operations, meticulously documented, ready to be presented as evidence. At 1:30 a.m. on October 18th, Theodore Watkins, the same lawyer who'd helped Bumpy with documentation in 1947 and 1952, notarized the complete accounting. At 3:15 a.m., copies were locked in 3 separate locations. At 5 a.m., the 6 runners received their final instructions. At 6 a.m., they would visit their Italian controllers and resign. All 6, simultaneously, and they would take their customer bases with them. Vinny Costello arrived at his office on Pleasant Avenue at 6 a.m. on October 18th. He liked getting an early start, reviewing the previous day's numbers before anyone else arrived. He made coffee, opened the safe, and pulled out the ledgers from the night before. He began his morning review. The Harlem operations showed $43,700 in net profit for the week. He cross-referenced with runner reports, looking for discrepancies. Everything matched, or seemed to match. At 6:23 a.m., his phone rang. It was Anthony DeMarco, one of the controllers who managed runners in Central Harlem. "We got a problem," DeMarco said. "Marcus Williams just called. He's quitting. Says he's going back to work for Bumpy." Vinny frowned. "Did you offer him more money?" "I offer him everything. He said it's not about money. Said he's realigning his priorities." "What the hell does that mean?" "I'll call him," Vinny said. Before he could dial, the phone rang again. Another controller. Another runner quitting. Then another call. And another. By 7 a.m., 6 runners, the 6 most productive runners in the Italian expansion, had resigned, all citing vague personal reasons, all effective immediately. By 7:30 a.m., Vinny realized something worse. The runners hadn't just quit. They'd taken their customers with them. Phone calls to regular policy players were going unanswered. The collection points that had been generating thousands of dollars weekly were suddenly empty. At 8:15 a.m., Frank Salerno arrived at the office. Vinny explained the situation. Salerno's face went from confused to angry to very, very quiet. "How much did we lose?" Salerno asked. "I'm recalculating now. But if those 6 runners represented accurate production, we didn't lose money. We never had it." "Explain." "The runners were keeping 2 books, recording bets with us, but servicing customers through Bumpy's operation. The profits we thought we were making, they were phantom profits. The customers were real. The bets were real, but the payouts were happening elsewhere." Salerno stared at the ledgers. "For how long?" "Based on the pattern? At least 4 months. Maybe longer." "For months," Salerno repeated slowly. "And we didn't notice?" "The books balanced. The numbers looked good. The runners seemed productive. How were we supposed to know customers were hedging bets through a parallel operation?" "Because we're supposed to be smarter than this," Salerno snapped. Then, more carefully, "How much did we actually make?" Vinny spent the next 3 hours recalculating. He cross-referenced customer complaints, analyzed payout patterns, and contacted other controllers to verify which customers were actually still doing business with Italian operations versus those who'd quietly switched back to Bumpy's network. By 11:30 a.m., He had an answer. The $43,700 weekly profit he'd recorded the night before was actually $11,200. Everything else was accounting fiction. 4 months of supposed expansion, $697,600 in recorded profits, was actually $179,200. A difference of $518,400 that existed only on paper. The money hadn't been stolen. It had never been earned. The expansion that Salerno had been celebrating for months was a carefully constructed illusion, maintained by runners who worked for both operations while reporting numbers that made the Italians think they were succeeding. At 12:15 p.m., Frank Salerno called a meeting. 12 men gathered in the back room at Rouse, the same room where, less than 15 hours earlier, they'd been congratulating themselves on successful expansion. Bumpy Johnson, Salerno said quietly, has been playing us for 4 months. He let us think we were taking his territory. Let's recruit his runners. Let's expand our operations. And the whole time, he was documenting that our expansion was fake, that our profits were fiction, that we were counting money we didn't actually have. So we go to war, someone said. We take back the territory. We make an example. With what? Salerno asked. The runners are gone. The customers are gone. We've been operating for 4 months thinking we had an empire, and it turns out we had a ghost. You want to go to war over something we never actually controlled. The room was silent. More importantly, Salerno continued, Bumpy has documentation. He has proof that our accounting is wrong, that our expansion was built on false numbers. You know what that means? That means if we complain, if we escalate this, if we make noise, he can demonstrate to every family in New York that we don't know how to count our own money, that we got outmaneuvered by a black independent operator who made us look like idiots. Vinny spoke up. There's more. I made some calls this morning. Bumpy's been talking to people, not threatening, just talking, letting them know that documentation exists, that the real numbers are available if anyone wants to verify them. He's essentially offering proof that we inflated our own success. If you're watching this unfold and wondering how documentation becomes power, how information becomes leverage, you're beginning to understand why these stories matter. Because history shows us that the most effective power moves aren't loud. They're surgical. They're patient. They're about letting your opponent think they're winning while you're quietly proving they never were. But in October 1956, in that back room at Rouse, the question wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about damage control. What does he want? Someone asked. I don't know, Salerno admitted. But I'm about to find out. At 3 p.m. on October 18th, Frank Salerno met with Bumpy Johnson at the Red Rooster on Lenox Avenue. Neutral territory, public enough that violence was unlikely, private enough that serious conversation could happen. They sat in a booth near the back. Both men ordered coffee. Neither touched it. You embarrass me, Salerno said quietly. I protected my territory, Bumpy replied, by making us look like fools, by demonstrating that your expansion was built on false assumptions. You thought you were taking my territory. You were actually paying my runners to record bets they were servicing through my operation. That's not me making you look foolish. That's you not paying attention to what was actually happening. Salerno's jaw tightened. We could escalate this. Make it expensive for everyone. You could, Bumpy agreed. But then I'd have to show the commission that your accounting is unreliable, that you reported profits you never actually made, that you expanded into territory you never actually controlled. How do you think that conversation goes for you? The commission was the governing body of New York's 5 Mafia families, the entity that mediated disputes and maintained order among Italian organized crime. Having your accounting questioned by the commission was career-threatening. It suggested either incompetence or deception, neither of which was acceptable. You've been planning this for months, Salerno said. It wasn't a question. Since June, when you started pushing into my territory, I could have gone to war immediately, could have responded with violence, with retaliation, with all the things that get people killed. Instead, I let you expand, let you recruit my runners, let you think you were winning. and I documented everything. Every false number, every phantom profit, every customer you thought you had, but never actually controlled. Why? Because war is expensive. War draws attention. War gets people arrested, killed, or worse. But information? Information is leverage. Information keeps the peace. You go back to your people and explain that the expansion is over, that the territory reverts to previous boundaries, that we return to the arrangement that worked for 20 years. And in exchange, the documentation stays private. And if we refuse, then I take the documentation to the commission. I demonstrate that your operation can't distinguish between real profits and accounting fiction. I'll let them decide whether you're competent enough to continue managing gambling operations in Harlem. How do you think that decision goes? Salerno was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "The runners who quit, they're back with you?" "They never left. They just pretended to work for you while actually working for me." "And the customers? Were always mine. They just let your runners think they were betting with you." Insurance bets. Hedging. Standard practice in policy games. Your accountants should have caught it. Vinny's the best. Vinny counts what people show him. Bumpy interrupted. He doesn't verify underlying reality. That's not his fault. That's the weakness of any accounting system that trusts reported numbers without independent verification. Salerno looked at Bumpy for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "You could have destroyed us." "Why didn't you?" "Because I don't want to destroy you. I want to coexist with you. The same arrangement we've had for 20 years works for both of us. You make your money. I make mine. Neither of us draws unnecessary attention. Neither of us triggers federal investigations or newspaper headlines. The only reason we're having this conversation is because you try to change the arrangement without asking. So we go back to the old boundaries." "Exactly. And the documentation gets locked away." Again, Salerno stood. "I'll talk to my people. But Bumpy, this only works once. Pull something like this again." "I won't need to," Bumpy said calmly, "as long as you remember the lesson. Which is that counting money too early doesn't make it yours. Having it, controlling it, being able to deliver it when promised, that's what makes it yours. Everything else is just numbers in a book." Salerno left the Red Rooster at 3:47 p.m. By 6 p.m., he'd briefed the Genovese family leadership. By 8 p.m., they'd reached a decision: accept the reversion to previous territories, write off the supposed expansion profits, and never speak of the incident publicly. The documentation Bumpy had compiled, 4 months of parallel operations, false accounting, and phantom profits, was locked in a safety deposit box at Carver Federal Savings Bank. Theodore Watkins held one key. Bumpy held the other. And everyone understood that if the arrangement was violated, if boundaries were crossed again, the documentation would be delivered to the commission. Nobody wanted that. Not the Genovese family, whose competence would be questioned. Not the other families, who would see an opportunity to challenge Genovese gambling operations. Not law enforcement, who would love to receive evidence of mob accounting practices. So the arrangement held. The numbers went back to reflecting reality. And Frank Salerno learned what Vinny Costello's ledgers had temporarily forgotten: that in Harlem, the numbers didn't belong to whoever counted them first. They belonged to whoever the community trusted to pay them. What happened in October 1956 wasn't just about money. It was about a fundamental misunderstanding of how power worked in Harlem's underground economy. The Italian Mafia saw numbers as accounting. Bets recorded, odds calculated, profits extracted. They had sophisticated systems for tracking money, laundering it, and distributing it up the chain of command. Their accountants were professionals. Men like Vinny Costello, who'd spent decades perfecting the art of making illegal money look legitimate. But they missed something crucial. In Harlem, numbers weren't just accounting. They were trust. When someone placed a bet with your operation, they weren't just gambling on a 3-digit number. They were gambling on you, on your reliability, on your fairness, on your ability to pay when they won, on your integrity when they lost. Bumpy Johnson understood this because he'd grown up in the system. He'd started as a runner in the 1920s, worked his way up through every level of policy operations, and learned that the most valuable asset wasn't muscle or money, it was reputation. When runners worked for Bumpy, they knew they'd be protected. When customers played with Bumpy's operation, they knew they'd be paid if they won. When disputes arose, they knew Bumpy would resolve them fairly. That reputation had been built over 30 years of consistent behavior, careful judgment, and strategic investment in community relationships. The Italians had money. They had organization. They had political connections. But in those 23 blocks of central Harlem, they didn't have 30 years of reputation. They had 4 months of expansion based on recruited runners who'd never fully switched loyalty. And when those runners were given a choice, continue working for the Italians with better commission or return to Bumpy's operation with familiar relationships, the choice wasn't difficult. Marcus Williams, the controller who'd been the first to resign on October 18th, later explained it to a researcher conducting oral histories of Harlem's numbers game. Working for the Italians was good money, better commission, more territory, but there was always this feeling that if something went wrong, you were expendable. With Bumpy, you were part of something, part of a community operation that had history, that had trust, that looked out for its people. When Bumpy called and said it's time, I didn't hesitate, because I knew where my real loyalty was. That loyalty, multiplied across 6 runners, dozens of customers, hundreds of small daily interactions, was what made Bumpy's operation resilient. It's what allowed him to create a parallel economy that existed simultaneously with Italian operations, while remaining invisible to Italian accountants. The mathematics were simple. A customer bets $5 on number 437 with Marcus, who's supposedly working for the Italians. Marcus records it in Italian books. But he also tells the customer, if 437 hits, collect from this address, one controlled by Bumpy. The customer agrees because they trust Bumpy to pay more reliably than the Italians. When 437 hits, the customer collects from Bumpy's operation. The Italian books show the bet as a loss. But actually, the bet was won, just paid by someone else. The Italian accountants see accurate numbers, bets placed, some won, most lost, but don't realize that many of the losses were actually wins paid elsewhere. Over 4 months, this discrepancy accumulated. The Italians thought they were netting $43,700 weekly. Actually, they were netting $11,200 weekly. The difference, $32,500, was being paid out by Bumpy's operation on bets the Italians thought they'd won. Bumpy spent $520,000 over 4 months paying out winnings on bets the Italians had recorded in their books. Why? Because it allowed him to build documentation proving the Italian expansion was fraudulent, proving their accounting was unreliable, proving they didn't actually control the territory they claimed to control. $520,000 to purchase proof that would prevent war, maintain boundaries, and preserve a 20-year arrangement. Expensive? Yes, but cheaper than what war would have cost. The arrangement, established in October 1956, held until Bumpy Johnson's death in 1968. The Italian families maintained their operations in most of Harlem. Bumpy maintained his operations in central Harlem. Boundaries were respected. Documentation remained locked away. Frank Salerno continued managing gambling operations for the Genovese family until his retirement in 1964. He never again tried to expand into Bumpy's territory. When asked years later about the October 1956 incident, he simply said, "Some people you can push, others you negotiate with. Knowing the difference is what keeps you alive." Vinnie Costello remained the Genovese family's chief accountant until 1971. He implemented new verification procedures after October 1956, requiring independent confirmation of customer relationships, cross-referencing runner reports with actual payout records, and conducting periodic audits of claimed territory. His accounting became more rigorous, more skeptical, more focused on verifying reality rather than recording reported numbers. The 6 runners who'd maintained parallel operations for 4 months all continued working in Bumpy's network. Marcus Williams became a controller, then a banker, and eventually retired in 1967 with enough money to buy a house in Queens. The others followed similar trajectories, successful careers in an underground economy that provided opportunities few legitimate businesses offered to black men in 1950s New York. Theodore Watkins, the lawyer who'd notarized the documentation, maintained the safety deposit box until his death in 1974. The contents, 4 months of parallel accounting, proof of phantom profits, evidence of fraudulent expansion, were eventually transferred to his daughter, who donated them to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in 1982. Historians who've examined the documents describe them as extraordinarily sophisticated and demonstrating a level of financial acumen rarely associated with street-level criminal operations. The parallel bookkeeping, the documentation of discrepancies, the careful tracking of which customers were being serviced by which operations. It showed planning, intelligence, and strategic thinking that rivaled legitimate corporate accounting. But more than that, it showed understanding. Understanding of how underground economies functioned. Understanding of how trust operated in communities where formal legal protections didn't exist. Understanding that power wasn't about who counted the money first. It was about who could actually deliver what they promised. The numbers game in Harlem continued operating for decades. It eventually declined in the 1970s and 1980s as state-run lotteries provided legal alternatives. But for the 30 years between 1930 and 1960, it was the economic engine that supported thousands of families, provided employment when legitimate businesses wouldn't hire black workers, and created wealth in a community systematically denied access to traditional financial systems. And in October 1956, when Italian accountants counted that money too early, when they recorded profits they couldn't actually control, they learned what Bumpy Johnson had known for 30 years. Numbers don't lie, but the people reporting them sometimes do. And the only way to know the difference is to verify the underlying reality, not just trust the ledger. Frank Salerno's accountants saw $43,700 in their books and assumed it was real. Bumpy Johnson's operation serviced the customers those numbers represented and knew exactly how much was actually being earned. By the morning of October 18th, when reality and accounting finally aligned, the difference was undeniable. The expansion was fiction.